My name is Roger Haston. I'm the Chief of Analytics or Chief Analytics Officer for PetSmart Charities, which is kind of this weird title, and I get to pretty much ramble around the world. And I look at data and research and innovation and all sorts of crazy things. My background, I never had any plan to get into animal welfare. I have a PhD in geophysics and an MBA in finance, and somehow I ended up in this crazy place. But I love animals and dogs in particular, and I love science and business and people. And I asked Amanda what she wanted me to talk about, and she said, whatever. And that's a dangerous thing with me, because that usually ends up into about a 4-hour conversation. But then she said, no, you only have an hour. So I'm going to give you kind of a mashup a little bit of 2 or 3 talks that I've given to try to maybe we've been kind of in really close vision on some topics today. I'm going to step back a little bit, and because I get to travel all over the country, and over the last 5 years I've probably visited, 250 or so facilities, and I've gotten the pleasure of kind of seeing the macro trends, a lot of trends that are going on in the country, and I want to kind of relate in kind of maybe a more quantitative way some of that kind of larger scale, so you have an understanding of how your world kind of fits into that bigger world. And it is really fascinating when you visit that many different facilities. You see every place is unique, every place is different, every place has their own unique challenges, but there's a lot of patterns that start to come out when you see that many facilities. And I would say the one thing that stands out to me more than anything else is the people that work in these facilities, that dedicate their life for very low pay, for very long hours, often in difficult and dangerous situations, from kind of the CEO to the ACO, from the vet tech to the kennel tech. These people really care, and they care deeply, and I think I'm always very humbled to come and speak and talk about what's going on in animal welfare, because I really want to represent, I think, the amazing work that these people do, and they're often, I think, underappreciated and often treated poorly, when we should be holding them up, because they are the heroes for both the animals and for the communities that we live in. So for me, I got into animal welfare really because I've had 7 dogs in my life, and they've all been really unique. They've all been different. Some have been a complete pain in the ass. And I love being in animal welfare mostly because I can use really cutesy names and nobody makes fun of me, and I get to put pictures of my dogs. These are I'm down. My boy Ringo over there to the right, he just died a month ago, unfortunately. But he and I climbed over 100 mountain peaks in Colorado together. He was an amazing dog. But it's that bond, that mutual relationship that I've had with dogs that made it all worthwhile to come and really got me committed to animal welfare. I keep pushing the button, it's not going to work. So today we're going to talk really a couple things: current trends in the U.S., a review of some data from Shelter Animals Count, a white paper that I wrote for them. It wasn't on. User error. Kind of talk a little bit about how we're measuring success, how we're thinking about metrics, how we're thinking about how we're doing. A thing I talk a little bit about live release rate, and the community effect, and really where do I think we're going when we go forward. And this is, like I said, a mashup of a couple really long talks. And if you go out to the Association for Animal Welfare Advancements, and you go under webinars and you come down here, you'll see two talks. If you want to watch them in full, I'm going to give you a real snippet of a couple of these 2 talks. And so some things will probably not make sense because I'm skipping 30 minutes of setup, but I wanted to give you a taste for that. But go out, take a look at them, send me feedback. Right away, I always like to highlight, because I think we get so caught up in our day-to-day of what we're doing, and kind of that desperation almost sometimes of like trying to help the animals that are within our world. I want to highlight two really important metrics to, I think, celebrate some of the success we've made. In 1973, there was over 13 million euthanasias going on in this country. Some people estimate maybe 20. It's hard to get that data. In 2017, that's down to maybe 1.5 million. And that's not that long of a period of time. And when you think about that decrease, that's really pretty amazing progress. And I think a lot of times we forget how far we've come. And the other key one is in 1986, there were only 4 states in this country that had felony provisions for animal cruelty, only 4. Today we have all 50 states that have felony provisions, so that's pretty amazing. We have a long ways to go, obviously. There's a lot of things we'd like to improve, a lot of laws and stuff that we would like to strengthen, but that's pretty phenomenal progress in 2 really key areas when we think about animal welfare. And I think what's interesting when you look around the country right now, and you can go Google almost everywhere, even in the South, you see in a lot of places intake is declining, and it's declining pretty quickly. And when we go up to places like the Northeast, Colorado, Pacific Northwest, they literally have almost run out of homeless dogs. Not so much cats. Cats are lagging behind. Poor cats always seem to follow the dogs. But it's very fascinating, and I don't think for a lot of us who have been doing this for a while, I've been in animal welfare now for about 15 years, we just never imagined that we would actually get here, where we were kind of starting to solve the problem we set out to do, and it's changing the way we think about the world. And I think the hard part about it right now is, and I'll talk more about this, is that in some places we've completely solved it, and in other places we still have a long ways to go. And that puts a big challenge when we start talking about how we're doing and messages and what's the right thing to do, because what's the right thing to do for one community may not be the right thing to do for another. And so if we're in the South in particular, we still have a long ways to go, especially when we get out into rural communities. They need a lot of help, they need a lot of support. It's about really trying to lift them up, not bring them down. And the other interesting thing, and this is some data from a really pretty major municipal shelter in Southern California, still pretty overwhelmed, is that in a lot of places now, shelters don't have the animals that people necessarily want. And in this, in the light blue is animals coming in, dark blue is animals going out. And if we look here, this is a pretty overwhelmed shelter. If you're a toy poodle and you go into that shelter, you're pretty much going to go in and come out. Not a big deal. They're doing a great job. And for some of the more popular breeds, but as we get on down to pit bulls and chihuahuas and German shepherds, you can see that gap is pretty big. So what's starting to happen in the country a lot is that we've done a great job of convincing people to adopt from shelters, that shelters are a great place to adopt, and we do a lot of good work there. But it's starting now to concentrate much harder to place animals in those facilities, and in particular in municipal facilities that have to be open admission and have to take everything that comes into them. I was in one meeting with a bunch of national leaders, and we kind of estimated that roughly 40 to 45% of all the kennel space in this country is taken up by pit bull or blocky-headed whatevers, or whatever you want to call them, that they're very difficult to place, and we have a much deeper issue around those kind of difficult to place animals than just simply trying to adopt them all. It's a much deeper problem that's got deep social connections as well, that we have to start to think about it from a much more community basis. And the other is really around the explosion of transfers, and what really kicked this off in Hurricane Katrina. Prior to Hurricane Katrina, there was some animal transfer going on, but it was all fairly localized, a little bit up and down the East Coast that was multi-state, but pretty much not all that much. After Katrina, there was just this need to move tens of thousands of animals, and it really set up an infrastructure that we see today, in which huge quantities of animals are being moved long distances. And this was a study from Mississippi State that estimated in 2016 over 778,000 dogs changed location. Now, that wasn't all from one state to another, but a lot of that is long distance transfer. And so when we start to think about animal sheltering and how we're doing and some of the issues that we need to deal with, when you think about that volume of animals changing location, we have to really start to think more deeply about disease protocols and all those kind of things that can happen when we move animals. But even more so, that it's not, we can't think about ourselves as one individual organization and another individual organization. We're becoming a very interconnected world. That what one person does deeply affects the other, and that this is all starting to flow together in a much broader system than we ever considered in the past. And I think we've also done a great job of convincing the public about what they should expect in shelters, and I've seen all levels of sheltering in this country. And you know, we still have a lot of places where it's pretty rough. I mean, they're in some dingy building next to the water treatment plant. But then we have a lot now with a lot of the major shelters, and you're starting to see these amazing facilities that really have become kind of family destinations. And we've done a good job of convincing the public that shelters are happy places, that they aren't terrible places. But that also puts a lot of pressure, especially if you're in a community that doesn't maybe have the resources to build a $50 million building, to how do we start to engage the public and not have them view us as bad, but view us as needing help and a positive part of the community. So I think especially in a lot of rural areas, we're fighting a public expectation now that at times can be unreasonable, and we have to be careful about how we manage that expectation. And on the good news front, I think, is now that I'm at PetSmart Charities in particular, last year we facilitated over 570,000 adoptions in North America. Just an amazing number. And in 2016, if I look at like PetSmart Charities, Petco, Tractor Supply, all those kind of things, it's what I would call retail adoptions. That it's a really nice example of a for-profit, nonprofit partnership where early on at PetSmart, the owners of PetSmart recognized that this was a beautiful retail space that groups could come in and try to adopt animals out of, and they were committed to that, and it's just grown beyond proportion. In 2016, it was about 1 million animals got adopted out of retail locations. And that represents a third of all adoptions in this country. And that's really a great thing. But it's also really interesting too, because we've built this basically sense of ourselves around sheltering as a place to come and adopt. But now all of a sudden we have this going on as well. It's become a really competitive world, especially in places that have made a lot of progress, like in the Northeast and all that. There's a group in the Pacific Northwest now. This is when I knew the world was changing. They actually charge appearance fees for them to go and do an adoption event. So they might get a car dealer that says, hey, I want to sponsor an adoption event to help these animals out, and they'll call up the organization. They'll say, okay, well, that'll be $2,500 and we'll bring some animals to show up. And that, I mean, to me, I was like, wow, how weird is that world? But it's really, I mean, it's an incredible thing, because it highlights how good of a job we've convinced the public that adopting is really the right thing to do. And this is a great thing, but it also is changing the world when now most of the animals, or a good portion of the animals, are going out via retail locations. The other really important trend in animal welfare that I think I wanted to highlight is, so I went out and I pulled data from over 250 shelters all over the country, ranging in size from about $250,000 up to $25 million, and I set their year 2000 expenses at 0%. So if 0% represents they're spending exactly the same amount of money that they were in the year 2000, and these numbers are inflation adjusted. So if I was out here at 2015 and it was at 0%, they would be spending exactly what they were spending back then. And what you see in the red line is the average of those 200 shelters, is that the cost of sheltering is up over 150%. And this is not because we're irresponsible. It's not because we totally overpay our employees. As I'm sure you guys know, we can barely pay a living wage. It's because now we've gotten better and we take on cases, medical cases, behavior cases that we could never imagine doing before. And that's a great thing, but the problem also is that it's really expensive to do that. And we have to really be cognizant that the cost of sheltering is going up, and this is starting to force what we see around the country, a lot of consolidation, the need to collaborate and share resources so we don't have groups simply duplicating the same thing, because that same thing is really expensive to do. Okay, so that was a real quick kind of, here are some trends. This is going to be a really fast run through, about 4 hours of material. That's my buddy Ringo again. See, you're going to get a lot of pictures of my dog. So I wanted to go shelter animal. How many people know about shelter animals counts? This is the national database that we've been working on for a number of years. It sounds like such an easy project to try to collect all the shelter data, put it into one space, and everybody's happy. Well, it's a huge project, but we're starting to get an awful lot of participation from around the country, and if you're not participating, you should. Just go out, it's easy to do, you sign up, and you can upload your data. And it's a good way to just get a sense, one, to track your data, but also just get a sense of what's going on in the world. And so I wrote a white paper on our 2016 data, and I wanted to kind of show you a little bit of what's going on around the country. And if we look at intake, I did by species and organization type, so we have shelters without a government contract, rescues without a government contract, government animal services, so that'd be municipalities, shelters with a government contract, rescues with a government contract, and then unspecified. And what you can see is that in the government animal services, we're bringing in far more dogs and cats. A big reason for that is that a lot of government services now just don't even deal with cats. They just quit doing it. Large, small, I mean, they just stopped. Shelters with government contracts, interesting, about even. Rescues and shelters without government contracts, you can see. And also the key thing here is that this is total intake. You can see that the bulk of the animals, certainly that we're getting reported, come from government municipalities or shelters that have municipal contracts is where most of the animals are coming in. It's always interesting to look at kind of what's the seasonality, because everybody says, oh, we have big cat seasons, or we have big dog seasons, and then yellow is dog and blue is cats. And so what you can see, pretty much intake is pretty flat for dogs all year round. We don't get really big peaks now. That may vary locally, but cats, you know, everybody talks about the cat mountains. The cat mountain still is there. You can see it's a big cat mountain. If we look, so I wanted to try to get a sense for how to measure overpopulation, which sounds like an easy thing to measure, but it's a little bit tricky. And kind of one of the best inferred metrics we have is to look at the number of juvenile animals coming into facilities. That kind of tells you if you have a high number of, say, puppies or kittens coming in, that tells you there's a lot of uncontrolled breeding in that community. And then you could infer from that there's still a pretty big population problem. If it's very low number of juveniles coming into the system, then it probably says you've probably done a pretty good job on overpopulation and starting to drop. And I want to highlight a couple here in puppy ratio. One is rescues without a government contract. And you will see that their puppy ratio is 35%. So that for rescues, the number of animals coming in, 35% of them are puppies, and 43.2 are puppies or kittens. And what's an interesting point here is that most of these rescues aren't actually taking in animals from the community. They tend to pull from government agencies and things like that, the municipal shelters. So they tend to pull much more adoptable animals, which kind of makes sense. But you can really see then if we want to think about overpopulation, if we go down to the government animal services and to the shelters with the government contract, they're actually down around 14%. So there's this really disproportionate number of juveniles being pulled out of the municipalities, which highlights that one slide I showed you from Southern California, where you're getting a concentration of much more difficult to place animals in the shelters. And if we look at it geographically, the map of puppy intake ratio, I like, this is once again why I like animal welfare, is there's no way if I was in geophysics that I could use such a cutesy metric as puppy intake ratio. But you guys all appreciate it, so this is why I'm much happier here. I feel like I'm home in animal welfare. So, I mean, not surprisingly, so the yellower colors mean there's a higher puppy intake ratio, which means would infer higher overpopulation. And so you can see the poor old South still's got some progress to do. You know, Texas and this area, New Mexico is quite high, and then interestingly, North Dakota is very high. And does anybody have any sense for why North Dakota would be so high?
Indian reservations?
Exactly. So it's a very interesting way where you can start to get a sense for where the concentration of some of the overpopulation issues are. Another big thing now, obviously, I talked about transfer. If we look at how important transfer has come, if we look at government animal services, the total transfer rate out, over 20% of their outcomes now are transfers across the country. So a huge quantity of animals basically come into government controlled services and then right back out to another organization. So that's become, I think, it's a really positive thing that they have a huge outlet for animals that they never had before. You know, and you can see rescue, much lower rates of transfer for rescues and shelters without government contracts, which makes sense. They tend to be the destinations. And if we look at how that goes, transfer out, where the animal's coming from, basically, once again, you can see now the good news is a huge number of animals are being transferred out of the South. And a lot of those now are going up here to where they're coming in because they just literally have no dogs. Probably the lowest areas of overpopulation are the Northeast. Colorado last year imported somewhere around 45,000 dogs into that state. And if you adopted a dog in Colorado last year, there was about a 60% chance it didn't come from Colorado. If you adopted a puppy in Colorado, there was almost a 0% chance that it came from Colorado. So it's very fascinating, right? It totally changes the way we think about the world. If we look at live outcomes, or just total outcomes by method, you can see the good news is adoption now makes up both cats and dogs over 50% of the total outcomes, so we're doing a great job. RTOs, dogs are up around of the total 16%, and probably for the ones that come in, for a lot of places now, dogs sit around 65 or 70% RTO rate. Poor old cats, once again, we're not doing good on getting, if a cat's lost, they're pretty much lost. Transfers out, you can see almost 17% in dogs, 11% in cats. I think, which is really phenomenal. The cats now, probably 5 years ago, nobody talked about transferring cats. Now cats are moving all over the place, and they're even moving multi-state. Return to field is growing, so that's become a popular thing. And then euthanasia, you can see 9.2% for dogs, 16.9% for cats. So when you look at that distribution, you can see that we've really created an awful lot of positive opportunities for animals now when they come into shelter. And I think sometimes, from my perspective, people get a little hysterical about the world's coming to an end, and they fail to recognize how much progress we've actually made. And that doesn't mean that we still don't have a lot of work to do, but I mean, I have found in animal sheltering, we are our own worst enemies. We never celebrate what we do. We do all this amazing work, and then we beat up on each other for not doing more. And I just wanted to have a few slides on here for everybody to see. We've made tremendous progress, tremendous progress. And I'm sure if we just looked at Kentucky specifically, which still has a long ways to go, obviously, I bet you the data from 10 years ago to now would be phenomenally different. And so I just want to make sure we celebrate, so we don't get compassion fatigue. So, live outcomes, what you can see, we're doing pretty well. And there's some weird data on this down here in the South, but generally, once again, the story is we need to have a focus on the South. We need to use all the methods we can to really get some resource down here, get the connections, build alliances, do all those things that we can do. And really, the line is kind of interesting. The line is moving from north to south. And I think in probably 5 years from now, what you're going to see is that whole conversation around overpopulation is going to be almost meaningless, and we're going to be talking about very different things about medical and behavior and community outreach, and it's just not going to be the same conversation that most of us grew up with. I had to put some, I'm in Kentucky, I had to put some Kentucky in it, and I think the key message that I really wanted and why I put this on here is it's not a uniform problem. When we talk about how are we doing, and this was, they had a bunch of stuff, but this was looking at good quality, needs improvement in many areas by county, and you can see that it's all over the place. So if I was going to talk about Kentucky, how Kentucky is doing, if I only talked about Kentucky, it really wouldn't tell the story that we have a much more complex problem than just how is Kentucky doing. It's about trying to find connections between the areas that are doing well and trying to connect them to the areas that need more help. So I thought it was just a good microcosm of what's going on in the U.S. as well.
Is this data from the UK study?
Yeah, that was from that UK study, that big report they did.
Is this from the actual white paper, or is this from the preview paper?
I think it was the white paper. Don't know for sure. Don't ask me too many specific questions. It's been a while since I read it. Okay. That's not right? Is what you're telling me?
Yeah.
Okay.
That's not the most.
All right. Dang it. I hate that. All right, I'll move on then. So I'm going to move into some work that I did that when I first really started thinking about grant making, my board said to me, we just want to make an impact. Tell us how we can make an impact. And that sounded like a really simple question. And being naive geophysicist, business guy, I went out and thought, all right. And that's when I started driving around visiting all these shelters and started trying to understand the metrics that we were using to measure success and all that, because I needed to know that if I was going to figure out how to make an impact. And that resulted in what I thought was going to be about a 40 or 80-hour project turned into a couple thousand hours. And the result of that was I ended up basically, well, two things. One is I looked at the metrics and I'm like, these are kind of crazy. They don't tell the story. They don't remotely tell the story of what we do. And the other was, it was hard for people to see kind of the interrelationship between one variable and the other. So I ended up programming essentially a animal shelter simulator, SimCity kind of thing. This is how nerdly I am. I don't binge watch Netflix, I write Python code. So I'm not going to go through all the details, but I'm going to kind of show you the results of that. And I think for me, metrics, and when I think about a lot of what we do and how we've thought about it, it's the way we've treated metrics has been a little bit like cotton candy, where you go to the fair and you see cotton candy and you think, man, that looks cool. I really want some cotton candy. And then you eat the cotton candy and you realize there's not much to it. It looks huge and there's not much to it. And then by the time you're done with it, you actually don't even feel that good. And you're like, why did I eat that cotton candy? And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the metrics that we're using have been using for success, why they have some significant limits, and why as we move forward, it's time to think about how we're doing it in a much different way, because we don't want to keep eating cotton candy, even as good as that looks. And so we're going to go to Wagsburg, Kentucky. Who's been there? Anybody been to Wagsburg? It's just outside of Louisville. Okay. Anyway, so this is my theoretical town, Wagsburg. You guys are taking me way too seriously. And they're going to open up a shelter. They expect to get about 3,000 animals a year. They have 150 kennels. They can't double up or any of that. And what we're going to do is we're going to run the model and we're going to look at how that shelter performs for an entire year. We can measure it every single year, all these attributes. And we run it. We have a big party at day one, and the whole town comes out. They cut the ribbon, and we get started. And we're gonna watch the performance of that shelter over 3 different live release rates. Here I put 85, 90, and 95. Orange is 85, 95 is in blue. And so we have the party, we run it, we're measuring our intakes over that period of time. And what we see happen by the time we get to the end of the year, and we're somewhat puzzled by this, the 95% live release rate has intaken 28% less animals than did the 85%. And that seems a little weird. So then we want to look at adoptions because that's what we really care about. We're trying to get a lot of adoptions. We want to get these animals placed. We do the same thing. We track that metric and we see there's a 27% drop in adoptions in the 95% live release rate over the 85% live release rate. And we're kind of puzzling over that. We look at, because we care about euthanasia, we look at cumulative euthanasias, and we do see a significant drop in euthanasias for the 95%, under 100. The 85% is up around 400, so that's a good direction for us. And then we look at length of stay, because I think length of stay is a very important thing. How quickly can we get an animal into a positive outcome? And here at the 85% live release rate, what you see, it goes up, and the average length of stay kind of stabilizes at about 20 days in this shelter. But if we look at the 95%, it climbs and climbs and climbs and climbs and goes up close to 90 days average length of stay. And a difference of 70 days average for a shelter is gigantic. Shelters just are not places to shelter animals. They need to be temporary way stations where they move in and move out. And so you see a pretty significant increase in average length of stay. And so this was puzzling to me when I was doing this, so I wanted to look at it. And so on this graph, I have lots of complex graphs, and I looked at live release rate on this axis. It goes from 65% up to 100%. And on this axis is percent of maximum potential of animals. So if 3,000 animals tried to get into the shelter and 3,000 got in, that would be 100%. And if we look at the red line at the top, what you see is the live release rate goes up, it cruises along at 100%. Everybody that shows up can get in. And we hit some point here in this model at about 85%, and you see all of a sudden it just craters. So by the time you get out to 100%, only 40% of the animals that tried to get in could get in. All right, so then on green, I looked at adoptions, and interestingly, as I start to increase my live release rate, my adoptions go up. And so I'm feeling good about that. And I get to a point, I get to about 85%, and then once again, you see something happen. And it all starts to crater and drop off really quickly. Euthanasia's in blue, you see that drop off to 0, that makes sense. And then this is kind of the equivalent, this is the animals turned away. And you see as we get higher and higher live release rate, more and more animals get turned away. And I thought there's something wrong with my model. That doesn't make any sense to me, what's going on. And so I thought, well, let me look at the animals that are in the shelter, and I classified the animals in the shelter by kind of easiest to place to hardest to place. And so in this case, the bluer colors are the easiest, the redder colors are the hardest to place. And I look at the 82% live release rate case, and this is the inventory over time, and this actually goes out to 2 years. And here you can see at 82%, the shelter is pretty much just full of mostly easy to place animals, and it's running at about 80% capacity. If I go to 86%, you see once again mostly easy to place animals that are in the shelter, and the capacity is starting to build up. I go to 90% live release rate, and now what you see happen is the shelter very quickly goes to 100%. It's running at 100% capacity, and there's a pretty big wedge of what I call class 5, or pretty hard to place animals. I go to 94%, that wedge grows. and it's running at capacity. I go to 98%, and this is truly unadoptable. Now I have a shelter that after 2 years is pretty much 70% full of animals that can't be placed,
Yep.
or very difficult to place. And suddenly it made sense to me why I wasn't able to intake as many animals at super high live release rates. Because now it's taking me longer to get those animals placed, I'm not moving as many animals through. And when we think about these concepts around capacity for care, and this, it's really about flow. And we've tended to think about capacity as how many kennels do I have, rather than how many animals can I move. And this is a very important point in when we think about how to manage shelters. And if we get too hung up on live release rate, it can drive us to start to clog up the entire system. If you think about freeways, you're driving on a freeway. Well, you guys probably don't have bad traffic here, but if you were in Phoenix with me and we were driving on the freeway, we'd be going along having a good conversation about animal welfare, and then all of a sudden we would hit a traffic jam, and we'd sit in the traffic jam for a while, and then finally we'd like, oh, there must be an accident. We get to the end, and then suddenly it starts going again, and we wonder like, why did that stop? And there's some really good mathematics around why that happens. Like any complex system, if you take it too far, it doesn't just slow down a little, it slows down a lot. And that's why you get freeways that just, you put one car too many and the whole thing stops. It's the same with shelters. It's why you see that it hits a point, it goes along just fine up to a point, and then the whole thing craters. And so the other key thing, and if you think about that data from Southern California where we had that big concentration of pit bulls and Chihuahuas and German Shepherds, there's a really anti-intuitive fact that if I wanted to sell a lot of Fruit Loops, and I stocked my store with nothing but Fruit Loops, I would sell less Fruit Loops.
Yep.
But if I stocked my store with some Corn Flakes and Cocoa Puffs and all that, I'm going to sell a lot more Fruit Loops. And when we think about those difficult to place animals, if what I'm trying to do is to place more of those difficult to place animals, the last thing I want to do is fill a shelter full of difficult to place animals. We see that in a lot of the studies that have come out around, how many cats should you display in your shelter and all of this. It's just a natural human behavior that if we want to try to do something, we can't overwhelm the public with choice, or else they walk away. And so I want to talk a little bit about the limitations of live release rate. And in my normal talk, usually at this point, either people walk out or they start throwing things at me and say, you just hate live release rate. And the answer is absolutely not. It's been an amazing metric for us. It's created a lot of focus. It's been really the only metric we've ever had to talk about performance, but we need to be cognizant of a lot of the limitations. And the example I use is you would never fly an airplane with just an altimeter. It's a very complex machine. We need to know our airspeed, we need to know the fuel, we need to know our direction, we need to know the altitude, we need to know a variety of things. And to think that we could measure a complex system like a shelter with a single metric would be foolhardy. It would be like flying a plane simply with an altimeter. And I would not fly with you if that's what you're going to do. And so what are some of the issues? One is that it really, and we had a talk earlier on the 5 freedoms, and for me animal welfare is really centered around the 5 freedoms. And when we think about live release rate, it really only looks at maybe one, maybe 2 of those aspects of the 5 freedoms. So it's a very limited measurement of animal welfare. It is also a metric that is the outcome of division by itself. So when you do that, it becomes a scaleless number. And so 9 animals adopted from 10 intakes would be a 90% live release rate versus 90,000 from 110 would be 81. If I only told you about live release rate, you would have no idea about the scale difference. And scale matters. Scale matters deeply. So we have to understand it does not reflect scale. Achieving a high live release rate is not necessarily the measurement of a good operation. And I see this all over the country where either somebody really extremely limits the type of animals they're taking in. There's cases in Colorado where the only thing they'll take in is a puppy. And right now in this country, having a puppy is pretty easy to, even I could run a shelter if all I had was puppies. And then we see a lot of warehousing, where people just don't want to create an outcome because they're worried about, they're so driven by that metric. And I don't think that, when we think about the 5 freedoms, is an appropriate reason to be motivated. And then another one is it's really highly dependent on the type of animals that come into your shelter. And I'm going to show you just really quick. Here's 2 shelters, exactly the same. They're run exactly the same policies. And we're going to run those shelters and watch what happens. The only difference is, if you look up here, I've got the types of animals coming in. And in shelter number 2, they have 10% more slightly difficult to place animals than shelter number 1. So we run that, and then we're going to measure how they did. And we look at the outcome between shelter 1 and shelter 2. What we see in shelter 2 is they did less intakes. They had far more animals they had to turn away. They adopted far fewer animals. Their length of stay went way up. The only thing that got better was the number of euthanasias they did, and the only reason that got better is because they took far less animals. Far longer term animals, capacity, operating costs, cost per adoption, revenue, everything got worse. But they operated exactly the same. The only difference between those 2 shelters was the type of animals coming in. And the key point I want to make here is that when we start to assess, and as a grant maker, as we try to assess how somebody is doing, we can't just look at the numbers of the shelter. We have to understand the community that they live in, because that's what's dictating what's happening in that shelter. So what may be good performance for one shelter might be terrible for another, and vice versa. And this was a big puzzle I saw as a grant maker. Oh, I should have warned you there's equations. But I knew you guys would all leave. So I go around the country and I talk to people and I hear this equation all the time, that live release rate equals lives saved. And that gets used interchangeably all the time, but the reality is this: it's not true. These are 2 incredibly different measurements. And rarely does live release rate equal lives saved. Sometimes they correlate, but they actually are measuring 2 completely different things. And when we confuse those 2 as being the same, it can cause our thinking to get really myopic. There, you survived the math. All right. So just, where does it leave us? And I really do look at live release rate still a lot, but I do it because with a lens of understanding its limits, that is dependent on intake, doesn't understand scale, can work against animal welfare, and is very easily manipulated and distorted. And that's what you see happening a lot, is a lot of times people are doing really crazy things to get a high live release rate rather than worrying about actually, how do I help the animals? And so I want to talk a little bit about now thinking about it from a much more community perspective. And once again, as you'll see, I like to look at 2 shelters, and we're going to go down to Purville, Kentucky. Who's been to Purville? Oh, come on, you guys. And in this case, I got essentially what I call an open or municipal shelter and a limited shelter. And initially in the model, they'll take any animal that comes. The limited won't euthanize anything. The municipal will only euthanize truly unplaceable animals. And then the limited admission is going to start to get stricter and stricter and stricter about what they will intake, until at the end of the model, they'll only take the best 75% of the animals coming into them. And nothing happens here. They don't change any policy. So one simple policy change over time. And if we go over here, right, initially, if we look at the animals that are being took to these 2, you'll see they're exactly the same. As they start to limit the admission, the type of animals coming in to the limited, what you see is no longer are any of the truly non-placeables are coming in there. Now that's grown in the open admission one. They start to limit even more, and now what you see is this big wedge of difficult to place animals coming into the open or municipal shelter. And as I showed you before, how you perform really depends on the type of animals coming in. And so if we look at what happens to the live release rate over time as they start to limit more and more, at the top would be the limited admission shelter that's limiting, and what you see is the live release rate starts off, they both start off equally at about 87%, and they start to limit, and it climbs and climbs and climbs up to about 97%. And in the blue, what you see is that municipal shelter that has done nothing different. They're operating exactly the way they were when they had an 87% live release rate, and their live release rate plummets down to 73. The key point here is what one organization does deeply affects the other. And we can't think about live release rate from one organization to the other organization to the other organization. We have to think about it all together. The interesting thing about this is that overall, between the two organizations, the live release rate goes up. But if we only looked at it as one or the other and didn't view it as a system, you might start to make some really bad decisions about the right thing to do. All right, so let me talk a little bit about, that was a very short version of a very complex talk. I think for me, when we think about where are we headed, where are we really going, and it gets back to that whole question about impact. And it's really about the impact that we can have for animals. It's the impact we can have for people. And a lot of times, because a lot of us got into animal welfare because we don't really like people and we like the animals a lot better. But we forget about them. And then fundamentally, it's about preserving, promoting, and respecting the bond between all people and all pets. And when I think about what got me into this, it was that relationship I had with my dogs that makes me committed, that mutuality of it. It has to be a mutual relationship, and when you really read up on the 5 freedoms, it's about mutuality. And idealism blinds, there's no doubt it does. And I read this really cool book that was How to Build a Powerful Mind. And they used this term called realistic optimism. And I really like this term because I think sometimes people, when we start to get more data-driven and all that, it kind of feels like we're losing the reason why we got in here. We have to have compassion. We have to have empathy. We have to have all those things. Our heart has to be part of this. But we also have to have our heads. And when I think about this, that realistic, that's our head. And that optimism is our heart. And when we let those two work together, it's super powerful. But that optimism needs to have that vessel of rational thought, science, data, all that stuff. Can't have one without the other. When I think about metrics, live release rate has been super powerful, but it needs a partner. All metrics need partners. If we think about what happened at Wells Fargo, they had really bad metrics. 4,500 people lost their jobs. Millions of people were defrauded. Why? Because they had a bad metric that caused a singular focus. Every metric needs a partner, and the yin and yang for me, and there's a variety of choices, but length of stay and live release rate are a really nice partner. If you have both of those kind of working in tandem, it tends to drive us in a much more robust long-term direction. And so it kind of brings me, and this really fits in well with compassion fatigue, and I was very intrigued by that talk, because this whole idea of moral stress and moral injury and all that I had no idea when I got into this what a paradoxical, difficult field this was. It all seemed so easy, and the paradox just is a statement that can conflict with itself, and here's the one I love: I never tell the truth. And if you think about that, you'll see that if it's true, it's false, and if it's false, if it's true. And if you think about it even longer than that, you're going to be drinking a lot of bourbon. Or go into the compassion fatigue. But, for example, save more lives. Does that mean volume or every individual? What happens if you have to decide between that? Or I was up in Canada giving a talk, and a guy, a pretty well-known ecologist, conservation ecologist, said, well, it's easy, just do no harm. And I thought about that for a while, but what if both action and inaction cause harm? How do you choose? And this is where we get really into the moral paradoxes that all of us face, and why it needs to be about coming together as a community, not tearing each other apart. And it brings me to what I would call the live release paradox, that as you start to get better and better and better at what you do, the depth and complexity of the moral dilemmas and the paradoxes that we face every day and what we do grow exponentially. The good of the one versus the good of many, quality of life versus quantity of life, and I put the fine line between altruism and narcissism on here. And I do this, and these seem like really opposite concepts. And I put it on here because it's super personal for me, because I had a dog when I was in grad school, my wife and I got the dog, and he went to school every single day with me. And then I finished up my PhD, and she was still working on hers, so we were apart for like a year and a half. And I had Cooper, and he was with me, and he kept me whole. And then when he was 15, he got diagnosed with cancer. And I hung on for about another 6 months, and then finally one day I realized it was time. I had to put him down. And now what tears me up when I think about that today is for 15 years, I was his guardian. I was his buddy. We were a pal. We had a relationship that last 6 months so subtly turned into being all about me. And I hold that with me every single day when I work in this field, because so quickly we can move from great intent, and that great intent can just subtly slide us into an area where we've lost perspective, and it can become very narcissistic. And so that's why I really like the 5 freedoms. The 5 freedoms is a really robust way to kind of keep us grounded and keep us from going too far one way or the other. And we can't save them all. We can't, but we can be humane to them all. And I have a deep belief that if we are humane to them all, we will actually save more. And with that, I will end with my very nerdly philosophical joke and take questions. Thank you very much. Go ahead.
So you create the model, and you have the model of one clinic that ends up with more of the easier adoptable pets, and you have the other, say, organization that ends up with less adoptable pets. How do those, like, does the one, what happens to all those less adoptable pets? Do they just keep taking them in? I mean, they're less adoptable. What happens to those animals in that situation?
Well, I mean, it depends. I mean, so in the model, what happens is they'll get euthanized, and that's why their live release rate goes down. Because at some point, there's rules and logic rules in there that says I need to euthanize them, or the length of stay just goes to infinity. So, and what you see in reality, I mean, because this is happening all over, and it's not. And when I give this talk, it's very difficult, because some people will interpret that as, oh, well, then you're judging me as bad, and that's not true. It's more about when it has to be a partnership, because there's a whole branch of work called the theory of constraints, and in any system, if you optimize the system for more than one component of that system, the system as a whole will run at a suboptimal. And so when you think about how we're managing that situation, it's this organization trying to optimize itself, and this organization trying to optimize itself, and everything's going to run suboptimum. Unfortunately, I think what happens right now is people see that because we're so focused on live release rate as an outcome measurement of success. What happens is then this tremendous amount of negativity gets pushed down to the organization that's trying to handle more difficult animals. Because things are tougher. Either they have longer length of stay, their live release rate drops. Instead of trying to come in and partner with them in a way that looks at the metrics as a system. So I think especially in communities that have a municipal shelter and say a private nonprofit, when it works well, when you have a good relationship between those, it works beautifully, and you see that, and the community is better off as a whole. When that turns into a conflict where everybody's focused around the incorrect measurement, it turns really negative. I don't know if that answers your question.
What would you suggest if somebody, say a new manager, concentrates so hard on the live release rate to impress the employers? How would you suggest to say, okay, stop, you need to rethink this? So what's your suggestion on that?
Yeah, we have a lot of, and if you go out and watch my Future of Animal Welfare talk, I spent a lot of time. There's a lot of messages that we've created that have been super successful for us. I mean, they have been super successful. They've raised a lot of money. We've gotten the public engaged, but part of the problem now, they're starting to hurt us. So I think there's a lot of work, and it's about starting to work with the community and get the community to understand that shelters are merely a reflection of the community itself, and we need everybody to get engaged around that. It's not just the shelter. And if I think what's going on with cats, there's some wonderful things going on with cats. But if you really strip it away, it's essentially, it's more a recognition of that the sheltering system just was not working for cats. Those cats are still there. And we're smart enough now to know that what we were doing for cats, like bringing them all into the shelter, just there was no positive way to go. But it's not really a solution around cats. So I think it's about starting to broaden out, build coalitions, talk to the community, change up our messages, much more about it being about the community rather than about the shelter. It's a hard one. We have a long road to hoe, and we need national groups to get on board with changing the messages, and we need to really start to engage the public in a different way than we have in the past. I know that wasn't a great answer. I don't have it, other than I know that's where we need to go, and it's about trying to get away from that as the sole measure of success.
Is that lecture you mentioned available online somewhere, or will we have to go somewhere else to listen to your talk?
It's on the, if you go out to the SAWA, or now the Association of Animal Welfare,
Okay.
that it's on, they have a webinars tab. If you go down there, the two talks are out there.
And I can send that link with all the stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I gotta go through a lot of slides. But
So, Roger, I'm curious if you, as a funder, also a spay-neuter funder in Appalachia, what I find is a lot of the counties, and there's some folks in the room, that there is no shelter. Tennessee is rampant with no shelters. Kentucky's got their fair share of counties with no shelters, and so I love data. I'm with you on that. Let's push my glasses up. But what would you suggest to the folks in the room when they're looking at the measurements of success when you drill down into those counties when there is no shelter, or the shelter is 2 chain link fences behind the sheriff's department type of thing?
It's a great question, and this is where, when we start to talk about the world as everybody's the same, it really irritates me, because if you're in a county with no veterinarian or shelter, you are faced with a totally different problem. On some other work that we're doing at Charities right now, we have a big economic impact study going on with the idea that what we really want to be able to do is start to go give people tools such that they can go talk to their municipalities to start to talk to them in the language they understand, which is unfortunately only money, and or maybe public safety, and start to be able to give people those tools so that they can start to say it's worth investing in animals in the community, because not only will it improve the community, it'll save you money. So we've got some work going on with that, and I think the other key thing is it's about building coalitions. Regional coalitions, I think, especially when you're in very underserved areas that have very limited resources. I think one, from just a emotional toll on the people doing the work, you can very quickly get isolated and feel alone and like there's no hope. And I think by coming in together in a room like this, starting to realize that there's other people that are working on a similar problem, starting to build a common voice that can get the public engaged to start to get more investment into those communities is important. I think also partnering with larger regional shelters that maybe have more resource that can start to help maybe move that along is really important. I can't stress enough the importance of building coalitions so that you don't have just one voice. One voice won't do it, but a lot of voices, I think. Eventually, politicians, as annoying as they are, if you're loud enough and you have enough of you in the room and you can say, we're going to do this together, then I think we can start to see some movement. But I've done, both the underserved and rural America have been deep focuses for me, and they're really challenging problems, and they're really irritating because we can make so much difference with relatively small amounts of money, and we can't get the municipalities to step up and even spend a little bit. And that just, and if you give me a couple shots of bourbon, I'll really go off on it. But it just really hurts. It just really hurts me to see that some small investments could make such a big difference in the parts of the country that really need it right now. And I think some of the, and I'll try not to get too much into my own political views about what's going on at the national level, but some of the language that's happening at the national level is tearing us apart, not bringing us together. And we have to stop that. We just cannot go forward with that language. It feels good, it's the cotton candy, and it feels good for a minute, but then the next thing you know, if I'm a city council that doesn't really care about pets that much, and I got two people yelling and screaming at each other, I'm just turning away and walking away. And we have to stop that. We need to find better language. We need to find language that takes us to where we need to go, that recognizes the complexity of this issue and how important it is that we keep people and pets together. And I'll try not to go down that path too far, but I think that's it. I mean, and I don't have good solutions other than we need to build a common voice. We need to set aside our differences and focus on what really matters. And I think if we talk about and think about, somebody said to me when I was ranting about the underserved and how poorly we treat them and how poorly we've treated the underserved with pets, and they said, well, you're trying to solve poverty. You can't solve poverty. And I was like, you're right, I can't solve poverty, but what I do know is this: I can make somebody's life better even if they are in poverty. I don't have to, I can't solve that. That's just this really big complex thing, but I do know that a person's going to be better off. Their life is going to be better no matter how poor they are if they have a pet. And I think that's something that we can all get around. I think everybody can get around eliminating suffering. There's nothing worse for me than to watch an animal suffer. It just crushes my soul. Just crushes it at a level that I can't even imagine. I never knew how deeply that affected me. And when I go and ask people, and I mean, if we talk about euthanasia and all that, I mean, it'll get all heated really quick. But if I pick one thing that I've found that will unite every one of us without fight, is around suffering. I mean, none of us want to see an animal suffer. And so let's pick that. Let's pick that as the thing to unite people around. And I think the public, nobody, I mean, they're confused. We've confused the public, but if we say, do you care whether animals suffer? Most everybody will say, no, I don't want them to suffer. I mean, a lot of cat projects we did, you get somebody yelling and screaming, I want these cats killed, and then you really talk to them, they're like, well, not really, I just don't want them in my yard. Okay, we can work with that. That's a lot different, they didn't really want them hurt. So I think, to me, it's really about uniting around those core principles and the 5 freedoms, and the basic things that are just so define us as humans and define us as sentient beings that brings us together. And I think the public will come with us. We're not crazy when we talk about that stuff. That's just basic human kindness. So, sorry for my long-winded answer to your question. All right. Well, thank you, guys.